Can the raindrop water drop resin technique be done with only epoxy resin? That's the question I'm going to try and answer in today's video, and if it works, I also want to know if we'll be left with the resin drop imprints on the molds just like we did in my previous videos with the UV resin. So today we're going to be making 2 resin coasters, and I'm so sorry if you guys are tired of seeing me make coasters. It's just that these molds are great for when I'm experimenting with resin. We get that flat surface that a lot of these techniques need, and plus because they're thin, that means I don't actually have to use that much resin to fill them. So that's my excuse. Anyways, the first thing I did was I mixed up some epoxy. Today I'm going to be using Nitro Pro epoxy since it's one of the thicker resins that I have, and afterwards I set it aside to degas. I let it sit for about 15 to 20 minutes, and once the air bubbles had mostly cleared, I went ahead with my silicone tool and started making my water droplets on my molds. I found that making the water drops with my silicone tool was a bit trickier than using the UV resin bottle. With the UV resin bottle, all you had to do was just squeeze out the amount of resin you wanted, and you could also shape it. But with the silicone tool, it felt like the resin was sticking to the silicone tool, and I had a really hard time getting the resin off. I think if I was to do this again, I probably will try putting the epoxy in a bottle with a nozzle to see if it is easier. Unfortunately, at the time of me recording this video, I didn't have any handy, so that's why you won't see me try using a bottle. Once I was happy with my resin droplets, I set my molds aside to cure overnight. Now here's where we're going to get some idea of whether this technique works with only epoxy. Epoxy resin tends to spread if it doesn't have a barrier, so if all these little resin droplets spread, we're just going to end up with a big blob of resin, so fingers crossed, you guys. Okay guys, it's now the next day. I'm in my craft room and I'm so happy. The resin barely spread. As you guys can see, everything is in place. I actually don't think any of the resin moved. So now we can go in with our mica powders, and this time I wanted to use something else other than chameleon powders. So I decided to go with this lavender metallic-y one, and then I found this random blue one at the back of my drawer, and I have no idea what it's like, but I thought let's use it, let's see what it's like, and yeah, so these are the 2 pigments that we're going to be using. With a small brush, I went ahead and started dusting my mold, and oh my gosh, you guys, this pigment looks so cool. That blue is so pretty, and I'm thinking this must be one of those interference micas. I don't know, but I absolutely love it, and I'm hoping this looks really good once that black resin is on top of it. If you guys know what kind of pigment this is, please comment it down below, because if it looks good, I'll need to get my hands on more of these. Then I did the same thing with the lavender pigment on the other mold. As I'm dusting on the lavender pigment, I am slightly regretting my choice. The pigment at certain angles looks more silver than lavender, but I'm just going to keep going and we'll see what it looks like in the end. I'm really curious to see what this technique is going to look like with these different mica powders. Chameleon mica powders are what's mostly used with this technique, so hopefully these ones here will give us a pretty effect too. Once the molds were dusted, I mixed up more of the Nitro Pro epoxy, mixed in some black pigment, and filled my molds. I ended up not mixing enough resin, so I had to quickly mix up another batch to fill the rest of that lavender mold. If you guys watched my previous videos doing this water drop technique, then you know my molds ended up with the imprint from the UV resin. If you haven't already watched those videos, I will pin the links down below in the comments so you guys can go ahead and watch them and catch up with those videos. But my hope doing it this time around is we won't get those imprints. Because we are using epoxy resin, we shouldn't get that sudden change in temperature on the mold as the resin is curing like we do with the UV resin. I'm assuming that that sudden change in temperature is what's causing the damage to our molds, and with this epoxy resin, it should be a slower, gradual rise in temperature and our molds should be okay. Again, I set the molds aside and let the resin cure overnight. It's now the next day and it's time to demold our coasters. Ooh, I'm really liking the look of the pigment residue we got on the top here, so hopefully the underside looks good too. Oh wow, you guys, just look at that blue. It's absolutely beautiful. I really need to get my hands on more of these pigments. But look, we got the water drop raindrop effect to work with only epoxy resin. We do have a couple of resin droplets that don't really look like water droplets, but at least the technique works. So now let's see if the mold has the imprints. And, oh yeah, I can see them. Boo. Man, that's such a shame. I really was hoping the epoxy resin wouldn't leave the imprints because it doesn't go as hot as UV resin, so this is a total letdown. Let's demold the lavender coaster now. Yeah, I'm not too thrilled with this one. You can see what I mean. As I'm moving it around, you can see at certain angles, it is more silver than purple, but oh well. Now let's quickly see the mold, and yeah, again, we have those imprints. Man, I wonder what it is. I'll definitely have to see if this technique works if I put a clear thin layer of resin first. The only reason I haven't tried it yet is because I'm not so sure the mica powder will stick to that layer of resin, but maybe in a future video we can try it and see if it works. Okay, so the last thing I want to do with these coasters is give it a thin coat of resin to dome them. I really want those resin droplets to pop. Be sure to keep on watching to the end so you guys can see the end results. Now, if you guys are wondering about this new resin I'm using, Nicro Pro Epoxy, it was sent to me to try out and so far I'm liking it. It is a bit thicker than what I'm used to and I'm probably just going to end up using it for mostly doming, but in this instant it worked out to my advantage. This project did work out, so it gets a thumbs up. By the way, be sure to comment down below if you guys like the powders I'm using here or if you think this technique should only be done with chameleon powders. So the one thing that's a downside about doing the raindrop water drop technique with only epoxy resin is how long it takes. Doing the resin droplets with epoxy, you kind of have to add another day of curing time to your project. These two coasters here took me about 4 days to make, and when it comes to epoxy resin, I'm actually really patient. I like that epoxy resin takes longer to cure because sometimes I'll come in and I'll see a mistake or a little air bubble, and even though the resin is still tacky, I can still remove it. But in this case, I think doing this technique with UV resin is the way to go if you really want to do it. And that way you can do most of the project in just 1 day. As you guys can see, the dome really finished these coasters off and really makes those resin droplets pop. I'm really happy that the raindrop water drop effect works using only epoxy resin. It is a total bummer though that we still got those imprints from the resin on the molds, but it is what it is. Let me know down below if you guys have tried doing this technique with only epoxy, and let me know what kind of results you guys got. Also guys, please don't forget, if you know what that blue pigment is, please comment it down below. It's really cool and I would love to buy some more. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and that you've learned something. If you did, please smash that like button. And if you'd like to see more of what I've tried with resin on my channel, then be sure to check out one of the videos that are popping on screen now. Thanks so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.